Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are connecting from today. Happy Monday, if it's a still Monday for you. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation in our Hacking HR live chat series. We've had a number of incredible, brilliant, super talented guests in our show, in our Hacking HR live chat series. It's been truly amazing. I hope that if you have connected to some of the previous conversations that we've had, you found a lot of value. I gotta say that I have found a lot of value myself, and it's been truly, truly amazing. So, if you have missed any of the previous conversations that we've had as part of this Hacking HR live chat series, you can go to our website, hackinghr.io, and there's a link that says, or a menu button that says live chats. And you can click there and you will see all of the previous conversations that we've had this year. All amazing conversations about so many different things. And yes, we're called Hacking HR, and our main community, I think most of you who are connected online right now or watching this replay, you most likely work in HR. That's mostly the makeup of our community. But you will find that most of the topics that we talk about, you will try to find a direct connection. You will think a little bit about it and you will say, whoa, where's the connection between this thing and HR? But as you reflect about the conversations that we're having, as you reflect about the insights that we are sharing in these conversations, you will find that connection. Whether it's a subtle connection or it's a very strong connection, you will find it. And I am hoping that it helps you improve the quality of the work that you're doing, improve your own self, your own life. And that's ultimately the goal, connecting, sort of sharing ideas that are outside of HR, but then connecting that with the work that we do and creating something that is much more beautiful than if we were just talking about HR. So I'm hoping that you find a lot of value in this conversation today, but also in all the previous conversations that we've had. We have an amazing lineup of guests for this week and for the upcoming weeks. So I'm hoping that you stay tuned for all this live chat series. Please let us know, everybody watching this live right now in any of our social media channels, please let us know where you are connecting from. Just put it in the chat. Let us know where that is. And if you have any question during this conversation, please post it in the chat as well. I have one eye on the screen in the conversation. My 2 ears in the conversation, one eye there and one eye in the chat. I know it's kind of hard, right? But that's what I try to do. It's not multitasking. It's being truly involved in the conversation. So please let us know where you're connecting from. And if you have any questions during this chat, please also post it in the, during this conversation, please also post it in the chat. We're going to be talking today about a fascinating topic on communication and conversations, the art of conscious conversations, transforming how we talk, listen, and interact, by Chuck Wisner. I got my book in here with, so selfish from me, I'm gonna say it, but thank you, Chuck, for your wonderful note when you sent me this book, and I am so excited about this. So I'm gonna welcome Chuck now to the online stage here. Good. I don't know. Is it good morning for you, Chuck? Is it morning now?
Yes, I'm north of Boston, about 30 miles. Yep.
All right.
Good
All right.
morning.
Well, good morning. How are you?
Good. I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm super excited about this conversation, and so is our audience. You know, part of the work that we do in HR is communications. That's core of the work that we do in HR, and I can't wait to sort of break down some of the concepts, some of the philosophies behind your book. But before we get there, I would love for you to please let us know more about you, so that our audience gets to know you, you know, who you are, the work you've done, why you wrote a book on conscious conversations. So please go ahead.
Okay. So I live north of Boston with my wife, and we have two sons who both live in New York. And the book came about. So I was formerly trained as an architect 40 years ago. and I was a partner in a firm, and in that process, I was involved in a lot of very, very difficult situations and difficult conversations with a lot of egos involved and people fighting. And it just kept ringing in my head that it's got to be better. And then one day we realized that one of our partners had a problem with alcohol, and we needed help. So we hired in some help, and a woman named Linda Reed actually came in and read the situation and helped us individually and helped us as a team to come out the other end in a healthier way. And I was like really wowed by what she did. It felt like magic to me. I mean, I knew how to do architecture, but I didn't know what to do what she was doing. And so I got intrigued, and we became friends and did some work together. And slowly over 4 years, I just was drawn to this idea of communication and conversations and language. And I studied the ontology of language, and I did some mediation through the Harvard Law School. And slowly but surely, 4 years later, I just decided to embark on a new career and said goodbye to architecture as much as I loved it. And it was scary. I had 2 young kids and no income, but I jumped and started a new career. So and then over the years, working with clients, they would say, what book can I read? And really, there's lots of books, but there's this book which will take a piece, and then another book will do another thing about language. And I wanted to compile that in a way that was really useful and applicable for people.
Oh, that is fantastic. What a career. And let me ask you before we get into the book, is there anything from architecture that informs what you do now in this working communication?
Yes, absolutely. People often wonder about that link. I think the piece of architecture training that serves me well now and helped me with my clients and with my book is the ability to take very complex ideas. In architecture, you would throw a program up on a wall and look at all the parts and all the pieces, and then you would just work that until you found a way to organize it all in a really simple way. There's a diagram called a partie. It's a French word, P-A-R-T-I. And that notion of taking complexity and boiling it down to its core. And that's really true with a lot of organizations I work with and teams I work with, because they're so in the weeds, they're so in their thing, and they're so sort of, the complexity of it is distracting, that sometimes we can stand back and go, okay, here's the core issue. Here are the core problems we can work with. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. And by the way, I am an engineer and I work in HR, and it does help me too. I think one informs my career as an engineer informs the way I approach things in HR, and
Yes.
and to me it's just fascinating. Chuck, in the book, you begin. The first part of your book is about storytelling conversations. It's all about
Right.
emotions. It's all about perceptions, reality, emotions. Can you explain more about that? Because I think this is so fascinating, especially, as I was reading it, I was reflecting about my own communication style. And when, given all that's happening in the world of politics and whatnot, when we communicate a message, we think we are right. This is the truth. These are the facts. And then you're confronted with somebody asking you a question for which you don't have an answer, or maybe you're confronted by facts that are challenging your story or the way you're telling this story. So can you tell us more about this one part of the book on storytelling conversations?
Yeah. And you're right that this is the very first part of the book, and it takes up a fair amount of space of the book.
Yeah.
The
Which I
other
love, by the way.
the other conversations are collaborative conversations, creative conversations, and commitment conversations. And those are all, have as important. But if we don't start with understanding and even investigating our own stories, the other conversations are difficult to master.
Yeah.
So this notion of really understanding that stories are a beautiful thing, when they serve us well and they are part of life. But when we have stories that don't serve us well, or keep us from collaborating, or keep us from being able to see new ideas, then we have to investigate them.
Mm.
And the reason it's hard is because most of our stories we adopt unconsciously. We adopt our prejudices, our judgments, our thoughts, our beliefs. Our whole life, for the moment we're born, we sort of adopt things from our families and our cultures. And so they become very much a part of our identity. And I'm not criticizing that, but I'm saying when they get in the way of us living a better life or having a better conversation or being more at ease, then we can take them apart and have a look at them non-judgmentally and say, wow, that really stressed me out, or that I'm really stuck. But when we take a non-judgmental look with a lot of curiosity, we can go, oh, I don't need to hold that quite so hard. I can let go of that a little bit, and we can practice sort of shifting some of those stories. The one I tell in the book is about me not being a big enough man, which was a message I received from my grandfather and some other men. And that lived with me as a little boy. That was the message. You're not a big enough man, because my sisters cried, but if I cried, it wasn't okay. And I didn't like doing certain things. And it literally wasn't until I studied language that I realized I had a master story that had me feeling smaller than with other men. And when I busted that story, it was, incredible change for me.
Master story. Can you tell more about that master story?
Yeah. So when I was studying language, one of my teachers, who was Rafael Echeverria, we literally had to dig pretty deep and say, what are the master stories we have about ourselves? And which ones are serving us, but which ones are maybe holding us back? And a master story, like my example, is a big enough man, or it could be something like, I've never been treated fairly, and I'm, or we all have different stories, and there's archetypal ones. But to take a look at them and to dissect them or deconstruct them is how we can unwind them, so that instead of being attached to them, our story has us. We can have our story and decide whether we want to change it or not change it. So this notion of witnessing, this notion of having a look, standing outside of ourselves and looking at our stories, is what can be scary, but it also what opens us up to say, oh wow, there's a different way of thinking about that, or there's a different way of reacting to that. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, and I'm thinking about a couple of things are coming to mind right now. One is awareness, and the other one is ego, because your story was a story. Sounds to me a story of belittling you, right?
Yes.
Story of diminishing you, but you find the other side of that coin are the stories of you're the best of the best, and you go through life thinking that you're the best of the best and that everything has to praise you and that you don't make mistakes and that you're awesome and that you don't fail, and it's the world that has it wrong, not you. And that requires that awareness, but also requires the ego, or controlling that ego or managing that ego and letting go or transforming those stories. And I know you talk a lot about ego and awareness in the book. Can you bring ego and awareness in the context of conscious conversations?
Yes. So the way I think about the ego, and there's much written about it, right? I think of it as being the piece of our mind that attaches to our story. So I have a story, and then I identify with that story, and then our ego is very willing and happy to help us hang on to that, cling to that identity, and get defensive or react in certain ways to maintain the story and maintain the identity. When we start shining the light of awareness on that, right, we don't want to battle our ego, but we just, in fact, what our best bet is to befriend it and go, okay, so what's going on here? What are you protecting? what can I learn? So the awareness piece is like literally shining the light. And then in the book, I sort of say, you know, there's four basic components. There's always a power issue. I mean, I had my story about not being a big enough man because the men in my life who I gave a lot of power to told me that story. And so I adopted it because they had the authority. They were the adults in the room. So there's always power issues. There's always standards. What is a big enough man? Their standard, I adopt it, right? There's desires. And so when I started looking at this egoic story that I was holding on to and identifying with, I could sort of take it apart and go, wait a minute, the facts don't line up here. You know, I'm a successful man. I'm an architect with two sons and a beautiful family. I'm 6 feet tall. That's not they don't line up, and that's where you start to unravel, right? And the ego, you know, again, we don't have to fight it, but we can sort of set it aside and go, thank you very much, but you know what, I'm discovering that there's more here than that one single story.
Oh, that is fascinating. Now, I want to ask you about awareness. Before I go there, I want to read the opening quote from your chapter number 3 about opinions and private conversations. And the quote by William James says, "A great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging prejudices, their prejudices." Um, I would love for you to talk a little bit about awareness, right? Especially when we approach conversations, when we approach difficult conversations, particularly. And that's the role that very often HR people have. You know, they have to approach
Right.
very difficult conversations at work with their teams, with their coworkers, they have to manage app. So how do we become more aware and approach those difficult conversations?
Yeah. So I think the first value of awareness is recognizing our stories, acknowledging, yeah, we all have stories, we all have prejudices, we all have preferences, right? Just recognizing that so that when we have one, we can, instead of it having us, we have it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but you know, we can look outside and we can say, oh, here's this story, right? And when we do that, we can begin to disidentify and make a choice. One, the metaphor I like is like for HR folks who are in a difficult conversation, people that are coming into them are pretty stressed out, pretty upset about something, and I liken that to going into a conversation with a closed fist. Like your position, your story, you're holding with a closed hand, like a fist. And you know, it's you need to defend yourself. You need to defend your story. And the piece of awareness is, well, if I recognize that I'm getting defensive, if I recognize I'm really stressed out, then can I go, okay, let me understand what's going on here, because in that fist there's a lot of emotion, and the emotions, as I say in the book, are a physical manifestation of our thinking. It's not the other way around. And so if I'm upset about something, if I can take the time to go, what's the thinking underneath my emotion? What's the thinking underneath my defensiveness? And if we can ask good questions of ourselves, what am I concerned about? What do I want? What standards am I measuring my judgment by? What power issues are? If we can begin to ask those questions, we can undo our fist and open our hand and go, this is why I feel this way. These are my standards. This is how I think someone abused their power. And we can at least start reveal, right? So that instead of having to defend and be afraid, we're revealing it. It can be vulnerable, you
Yeah.
know, and you need to have some humility
Yeah.
to do that. But when that happens, a conversation can dramatically change,
Yeah.
and an individual can dramatically change, right?
Yeah.
that's the miracle of, not the miracle, the magic of mediation, because in mediation, both parties, a good mediator is helping both parties to open their fists and reveal, this is why I'm so angry, this is why it matters to me. And then you start building bridges. But the people are much, with an open hand, they're much more willing to listen to why the person on the other end of the argument is upset as well. And you
Yeah.
build bridges. Does that
Now,
answer your question?
yeah, it does. And I want to ask you actually a follow-up question, because you have these stories in your mind, right? And you go to a conversation and you bring those stories. You think the facts validate what you think, and you see reality through the lenses of your own stories, and whether your master story or the smaller stories that reinforce that. But then maybe you're in a conversation, and in the middle of the conversation, you realize within yourself, I am wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's something wrong about what I think, or some facts don't align with what I thought. But then you still don't give up, or you still don't, you are still so entrenched in that position because you think that saying I was wrong, or let me open up my fist, is equivalent of losing. What do you say about
Right.
that?
Yeah. I think in some ways we are all trained to be the knower, to have the answer. And we're rewarded for that. We're rewarded in school. We raise our hand not because we have a question and want to debate the teacher, but we raise our hand because we have the answer, right? And and then we go into business, and we're rewarded for being the smartest one in the room. So there is a cultural sort of prejudice toward having the answer and being the knower. And that feeds into our ego, and that feeds into our identities, right? And I believe that the trap there, and especially for leaders, the trap there is the inability to say, wow, this is a complex issue. I don't have the answer, but I really want to find out,
Yeah.
or the ability to just say, I don't know, but let's find out. Let's do a little digging here and a little research and find out what the right answer is. And that's a switch from, I'd say, an arrogant stance to a more humble stance.
Yeah.
Right? Because to ask that question or to say, I don't know, takes a fair amount of humility and a dash of vulnerability. And that's a very large leadership gap.
Yeah, yeah, and it requires, I would say, I would argue that it requires a lot of strength to say I don't have the answer, or I had an answer and it was not the right answer, or it was a partial answer. And with your perspective, I am expanding what I know. Now I know more. Now I can make
Right.
more connections, and that really requires that component that you talked about before of humility, because we want to be right, and being right, or being wrong, or being only partially right may hurt some people, right? It may hurt them in because it's their ego,
Right.
and whether they are the know-it-all kind of person, and that's hurtful for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Oh, go ahead, Chuck, please.
No, it sounds easy, but it's a
Yeah.
pretty big switch for people.
Yeah.
To go, wait a minute, I don't have to have all the answers. In fact, the better the experts have the best team, and they have to rely on them, because the higher you get on the ladder, the less you can know. I mean, you just can't know it all. And you have to rely on good people.
Yeah, especially these days, right? When there are so many new things popping up every nanosecond. I mean, It's like at the end of today, no matter how much you learn, you will know way less than you knew at the beginning of the day, because there are so many new things that came up, and you will need to rely on your teams. Now, let me ask you, Chuck, and this is an overarching question that comes to my mind all the time. One thing is being aware of what you have to do, and a different thing is actually doing it, right? So, we got me here as part of the audience, right? And our audience here, we're listening to you, and we're like, yep, that's what we got to do. Yep. And then we go back within an hour from now, we go back and we're like, no, you're wrong and I am right. I have the facts, you don't have them. How do we finally say, not only is that the right thing to do, but I I now want to put that into practice. I now want to embrace that in my life. How do we do that? And I know this goes way beyond sort of the concepts in the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, not really. When we begin to acknowledge and work with our stories, then, that next conversation, which is the collaborative conversation, which is where we get to test our ability to either we are still defensive or we find that we can be less defensive. And that dance of how we advocate and how we inquire is really what the collaborative conversation is about. And so that's where we get to put our individual work around our stories and our defensiveness and our judgments. That's where we get to practice, because it's that practice field with other people that that's when we can write and we can do our reflections and we can do our journals and do the self work, but then we go into a room and there's 5 other people, 3 of which we disagree with. That's where we get to practice, right?
Yeah.
And that is, I really think the word practice is important here, because everyone listening knows that whether you're learning piano, golf, whatever, you're just not going to go from understanding your stories into a collaborative conversation and have it be perfect.
Yeah.
Because you're rewiring your neural networks, right?
Yeah.
So it takes some time, and we have to be patient with ourselves, and we have to be non-judgmental as best we can. And the switch, I think, is the biggest switch is learning to open up with curiosity so we can ask questions to understand others' perspectives. Because we're all trained to be that knower, to have, no, this is my position, this is what I think we should do. And to just give that a rest and say, okay, let me just go into this, let me practice asking questions to better understand someone else's position. And so I think it is a practice. But what we find is the more we can do this collaborative conversation, where we're in that dance of telling and asking, the more we slip into the creative conversation, which is where idea generation happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I just think practice, because there is no magic pill and there is no magic switch.
Yeah. Yeah.
That, I'm never going to do that again, and boom, we hit the switch. Doesn't work that way.
Doesn't work that way. We wish it did, right? But it doesn't work that way. And now let me ask you, from an organizational perspective, we're talking about the individual level, but now at an organizational level, how do you reinforce that? What could you do to say to encourage people to ask questions, to encourage people to acknowledge you don't have the answer, or the answer that you had is not the right answer anymore? How do you encourage that as an organization?
So organizations are many, well, it depends on how big the organization is, right? But if let's bring it down to a team level, right? Where we say there's 30 people in the team, or even 10 people in the team. I think for a leader, or even for an HR person, to somehow, to very purposefully guide the conversations that groups are having. So whether it's 3 people or 10 people or 30 people, to recognize that without some guidance, conversations default to the person with the most stripes in the room, the person with the most power, the person with the loudest voice, the extroverts take over. So to recognize that that's sort of the pattern, and then go, okay, you know what, we need to create some time. And I'm not talking about hours. 15 minutes. We have a hot issue here. What do you think about AirPods, right? We have a hot issue. Let's go around the room. I'd like to hear as many different perspectives as possible, and to make that purposeful, create that purposeful conversation. Because I don't know if you're David Bohm, who is a physicist and created something called dialogue. what happens is when we sit in a room and sit in a circle and we hear different perspectives, there starts to be a synergy in the room, and people's, you know, narrow thinking can get opened up. It's like
Yeah.
we pry it open little by little, and and then all of a sudden learning happens. Oh, I never thought of it that way, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for teams and for leaders, there's an art to say, let's be conscious of what conversation we're having,
Mhm.
instead of just letting it run its normal course.
Yeah. Because
And meeting,
the normal course will be, like you said before, the power, the uh, the extroverts, the
right.
loudest voices, the always voices.
That's right. And that's one reason that meetings suffer,
Mm.
uh, because we aren't being purposeful about why we're there and what conversations we need to have. Um, and so with my teams, I work a lot around those distinctions to help them uh, create more productivity and more collaboration.
Yeah, I love that. Now you're in the part number 2 and part number 3 of the book. You talk about collaborative conversations and creative conversations, and I would love for you to, maybe explain a little bit more about what is a collaborative conversation and what is a creative conversation.
Okay. So I touched on the collaborative in that it is the dance between telling and asking,
Yeah,
and we're programmed to tell, we're programmed to advocate. But we are not very well trained in inquiry. Uh, Most of the time when we're asking questions in a veiled way to prove our point or to disprove someone else's point, right?
yeah,
But a good question, like someone says, I think these AirPods are just useless and they're too expensive. Whatever. I'm just picking on AirPods. um, but for the other person to go, wow, help me understand why you think that. Like, what standard are you using to measure that you think they're too expensive?
mm,
or or what is your concern, or what do you want from uh, headphones that you aren't getting? So those kind of questions are in a way helping the collaborative conversation. If you ask those questions of other people, you're helping them open their fist to reveal their
yeah,
thinking, which I call the underbelly of their position, right? That we have a position and we have an emotion, but underneath that are all these things that we forget to reveal because they're so obvious to us that why would we tell anyone? Of course they think like we do, and that's
yeah.
just not true, right? So the collaborative conversation is that real art, that dance of telling, asking, advocating, inquiring. And we can do both. We can advocate better and we can inquire in a better way.
Yeah.
Instead of advocating like this, we advocate like, let me tell you why I think this way. Let me tell you why I'm
Mm,
concerned. Let me tell you what my desires are. And that's that open-handed, more humble, more vulnerable way of advocating. And the same is true with inquiry. Instead of being an inquisitor and probing people to prove them wrong, we really ask good questions, right?
uh,
When we do that conversation really well and we're in that dance and people start going, wow, I never thought of it that way, and we start sharing and learning together, then the creative conversation kicks in.
mm,
We can purposefully have that conversation, but oftentimes in a good collaborative conversation, creativity just starts happening because
yeah.
people's minds get synced up, and ideas start bubbling up. It's like an idea I didn't have, an idea you didn't have, but in our collaborative effort, an idea comes and one of us goes, wow, we could do it this way. And that didn't even exist 10 minutes ago. Right?
I love that. And it ties back to, by the way, these are part 2 and 3 of your book, but it ties back
Yeah.
to actually the first quote of the first chapter of the book, which is reality is always kinder than the stories we tell about it. And I love
Yes.
that because through the power of inquiry and questioning and curiosity and humility, you can discover so much more than perhaps your own perception of reality, your own limited perception of reality. And I think that's powerful. And in fact, I don't know if you observed this at the very beginning of the pandemic, perhaps the first 6-12 months of the pandemic. I remember so many companies struggling to financiers on how to stay in business, right? How to operate. And I saw so much humility from business leaders saying, I have no idea. Let's come together and find the answers together, right? I mean, these are the questions, how do we make the money? How do we stay sustainable? How do we stay relevant? How do we stay in business during and post-pandemic? We don't have the answers. And we know that the answers are not the same things that we were doing before, because this is a totally different set of circumstances. So what do we do? And they opened up that conversation to everybody. And to me, that was so beautiful.
Yeah, no, it's like, there you have a situation where a crisis forces people to say, oh my gosh, we can't do it the same way. We can't afford to cling to the old thinking, the old way. And so that crisis forces you into being more creative, more collaborative. My point in the book is, let's not wait for a crisis. Every meeting we have, every issue we have can benefit from better collaboration and benefit from idea generation. Right.
There's a
and the last conversation is commitments, which is where we agree to who's doing what by when, and that's a very complicated but powerful conversation. But my claim is that we in general, let's just say for a meeting, right? We all go into the meeting, we have our story. I have my story, they have their story. The biggest voice, the loudest voice, the person with the most power says, okay, here's what we're going to do, or this is what we should do. And then we take action, right? So that's what I call a conversational bypass. We go from a storytelling to commitment. What are we going to do? And these two middle conversations, collaboration and creativity, get totally skipped over. And what we miss is that juicy wrestling with an issue where we can learn together and maybe create some new possibilities that otherwise wouldn't have surfaced.
Yeah. You were making me think of a quote, by the way, which I just couldn't remember, and I had to look it up how it goes. But I don't know if you've heard it. I'm sure you have it. It goes like this: if you have an apple and I have an apple, and we exchange these apples, then each of us will have an apple. But if you have an idea and I have an idea and we exchange these ideas, then each of us will have two ideas, by George Bernard Shaw. And I love that quote because it's exactly that creative power of the conversations you're talking about, right? It is when you create a space, vulnerable, safe space for those conversations to happen, for people to come forward and say, I don't agree, or I agree, or this is how I see things, or these are my questions, then you're opening up possibilities for others to say, well, I had these ideas before, but now with your ideas, if we combine them, we have something that is so much better than what I had at the beginning. And that to me is so beautiful.
Yeah. And we honestly, it's almost like magic, because nobody is creating that new idea. It's the synergy of the conversation where minds open up and ideas bubble up in our minds, and we go, oh, wow. And that's really magical.
Absolutely. Chuck, as we get ready to wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you one last question. The title of your book is The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. And I want to ask you, what's your dream when it comes to communications within organizations? Because, I know, societies are so large and countries and whatnot, but at the level of organizations, what is your dream when it comes to the outcome of the transformation of how we talk, listen, and interact with one another?
Yeah. I believe that the normal pattern, and too often what teams focus on is and rightly so, they have a job to do. They're building a product or they're creating a service, and they have that's their task, that's their action. And that is, and it drives their mission, right? So that's really critical. And we need to be competent to do whatever we're trying to do. But there's two other parts of the equation that we don't pay enough attention to. And one is the individual being aware of what they're bringing to the table, as far as their stories, their way of interacting with people, their ability to collaborate, their ability to co-create. And the other part is the cultural part, how we work together, how we play together, how we think together, how we decide together. And I think that if you think of that as a triangle, the task is up here at the top and it's the tip of the iceberg, but under that iceberg are individuals that are on a scale from, really super productive and good collaborators to people that are arrogant and aren't.
Yeah.
Right. And then there are cultures. The culture of a company and a team really matters. And I believe we don't pay enough attention to that. There's a lot of lip service to it, but to really dive in and go, okay, how do we want to work and play and think together?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about a day's seminar. I'm talking about let's put down 4 things and let's work on these. And the cultural piece and the individual piece becomes a different practice.
Yeah.
Let's lean into that. Let's do that better. Let's have better meetings. Let's have better collaboration.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the beauty of it, by the way, is that it can rely on collaborative and creative conversations as well, right? Even that process of thinking, what do we want our meetings to be like? What do we want our collaboration and cooperation styles to be like? Even thinking about that can open up to the possibility of just thinking, hey, how do we create some conscious conversations around collaboration and creativity here? So I think that's fascinating. So Chuck, thank you so much for being part of this live chat series with us and for sharing all of your ideas with our community and everybody who's tuning in live right now. Thank you so much. I've seen your comments. I've been seeing your comments in the chat. Thank you so much for staying so engaged. I hope you join us for the rest of our live chat series this week, and of course the upcoming weeks as well, because we have an amazing lineup of guests coming up to our show. So Chuck, thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you all soon. Thank you.